in Michigan, there's around 86 counties. And what was analyzed here was a top 4 counties were analyzed: Oakland County, Macomb County, Kent County, and Wayne County. By the way, all the data we're looking at, there's 2 sets of data: the early voting data and then the voting data on election day. In some cases in Kent County and Wayne County, we combine them. But so there's 2 sets of data. So let's proceed. Now, the executive summary, this is what you're going to get out of this. So if you need to leave right now and you got to run off to do something, the conclusion of this, which we like to present up front, is that there are in the 3 major counties that were analyzed out of the 4, Trump's margin was reduced by a minimum of 138,000 votes. I'll repeat that. President Trump's margin was reduced by a minimum of 138,000 votes. So what that means is Trump's vote total was decreased by 69,000, and Biden's vote total was increased by 69,000. In short, 69,000 votes were transferred from Trump to Biden in these counties, and they varied across those counties, but a total of 69 counties. The other piece is this quote unquote transfer was done by a computer algorithm that linearly transferred. What that means, it transferred votes in a proportional basis. For example, the more votes got transferred from Trump to Biden, interestingly enough, as you went to precincts that increased in Republicanism, which means there were more Republicans in that precinct. So basically, and we'll show you, so the vote transfer really occurs more in Republican-based precincts and less in non-Republican-based precincts. Okay? So again, a little bit of background. In Massachusetts, we have one type of voting, but in Michigan, as I've come to learn, there's 2 types of voting. One is you can just go vote for an individual candidate. You walk in, you can say, I'm going to vote for Biden or Trump or candidate A or candidate B. Typically, independents may be like this. Or there's another thing called straight party voting. Straight party voting, which means you just go in and you say, I'm just going to vote for all Republicans or I'm going to vote for all Democrats. Okay? So obviously, President Trump is running as a Republican. When you do straight party voting, he gets that vote. If Biden is running as the Democrat candidate, he gets the Democrat vote. But there's 2 types of voting. Interesting enough, each precinct tracks a voter either as casting the straight party vote or the individual candidate vote. Okay, they are separated. And Phil, in the analysis of the data you got data for Michigan in both forms, as I understand.
Correct.
Okay. So now so to give you an example, because again, part of here is we're going to discuss complex stuff, but I believe we just tested this on a bunch of our friends here. Everyone got it. So don't worry about the math. It's going to be easy, but let me just keep it simple. Okay. Now there's 2 types of voting at a precinct. And here's an example. So let's say 200 total voters go to a precinct. Okay. So 200 people walk into that precinct. Let's say 100 of them decide to vote the straight party method. So and let's say the votes happen to be 60 votes for Republican candidates and 40 votes for Democrat candidates. So that would be 60% R, 40% D. So that you could argue that that precinct of voters who chose to do the straight party method, it's an indicator of the demographics that precinct is probably likely a Republican. The other 100 voters who didn't want to do the straight party voting, they chose to do individual candidates. And in this case, we're looking at, let's say 65 votes went for Trump, and let's say 35 votes went for Biden. So that you'd have on the individual candidates percentages, 65% Trump, 35% Biden. Now, when you got to put it all together, you'd have the total vote count. So you'd have, just to be clear, this, if you want to count the Trump votes, so 60 votes for people who did straight party would come to Trump. That's at 60. 65 who did for the individual. So 60 plus 65, we have 125. So 62.5% of the votes went to President Trump. And then you have 40 from the votes for the Democrat straight party and 35 for Biden. So that'd be 75. So 37.5. So that's what the news would report. Okay. But this is an example to give you an understanding of the straight party voting method and the individual and how they combine. Hope everyone's got that. Okay. Now the analysis that was performed here compared 2 very specific metrics. So these metrics were plotted on the x-axis and the y-axis. You need to listen very carefully here, and I'll go through it very slowly because this is probably the most important thing to understand. We mathematicians, we engineers, we can sort of grasp this, but none of this is valuable if this kind of knowledge just gets hidden away in some affidavit in some lawsuit, or it's just put away in some, brief somewhere, or it's just in some, YouTube channel no one sees. So the goal of this part I'm going to go through right now is to educate you in a very methodical way so you can teach this to your friends and family. So listen very carefully. So the analysis here include two metrics, right? So one metric is plotted on the x-axis, the other metric gets plotted on the y-axis. So one of the metrics, so we're going to compare, by the way, the data for any county is going to be, so for any county, we're going to look at all the precincts. Some of these counties have 200, 300, precincts. And for each precinct on the x-axis, we're going to look at the Republican straight party votes, okay? For precinct, how many Republican straight party votes were there? And on the y-axis, we're going to look at the direct Trump individual candidate votes, which means how many people voted directly for Trump. Okay, so it's focused around Trump here. So plotting on the graph, again, to be clear, on the x-axis, we're going to have Republican straight party vote percentages, right? And on the y-axis, we're going to have the difference between the percentage of people who voted for Trump in the individual candidates vote minus the people who voted straight Republican percentage votes. And this will get clear. So consider this case. Let's say 60%, let's say the vote in a particular precinct was of the people who voted straight party vote, 60% voted Republican. Okay, so that number would be 60%, which you would plot on the x-axis. And let's say for that same precinct, the individual percentage vote count for Trump was 65%. Okay, so what would you do? On the x-axis, you would plot 60. But on the y-axis, we're going to take the 65% minus the 60 to get 5%. Okay? Let me repeat that again, and I'll show you through on a graph. So if you look at that number, so on the x-axis, we have the Republican straight party vote. And you can see here in this example, right, 60% is plotted. We go look along the x-axis. And along the y-axis, we're doing this calculation of the percentage of votes Trump got minus the percentage of votes that for the Republican. Now, why are we doing this? Well, if you're a Republican, most Republicans probably voted for Trump, okay? Now, in some precincts like this one, it looks like 5% more people, which could have been Democrats or independents or others, even Republicans, voted more for Trump, because this means Trump actually got 65% minus the 60. So, and if you look at another example, this may have been, if people want to believe the bias, all Republicans are very wealthy, et cetera, this may have been a wealthy Republican neighborhood. And that maybe this was a quote unquote working class neighborhood, which was, let's say, more Democrat. Again, this is a bias. It's not true actually, but let's assume this. So in this case, along the y-axis, we see the straight party vote in this precinct, which may have been a very different neighborhood, was 7% Republican. And even in here, in this case, we're saying Trump may have gotten 12% minus 75%. So that's what we're putting up here. Benny, does that make sense? Everyone?
Got it.
Okay, I know you guys have seen this.
The blue dots are precincts, so
yes.
That may be a little bit.
Yeah, so just to be clear, every blue dot is a precinct. So in the normal case, if you look at this, if the center line, the red line, is Republicans, okay, straight line, because the reality is that anyone who voted Republican probably voted for Trump. So if you look at all these precincts, they should hover around 0, right? So for example, any one of these Republican straight party votes, if you looked up and you looked at what the Trump vote was, it should be close to 0. All right? Any questions? All right, good. So now let's take a case where maybe Trump, and there's some evidence to this, was actually doing better than people are voting just for Republican candidates. Maybe he was getting more votes from others, okay? In that case, the graph would look like this, right? In this situation where Trump is more liked than Republican Party candidates. So if you were just a straight Republican Party candidate, you'd be at 0, but you notice these precinct data saying that, hey, Trump was actually liked more than the straight party, than the general Republican slate that was running, okay? So that's sort of gives you an idea, normal case, and this could be where Trump's liked. Now we're going to go into the data that Phil analyzed. And So what Phil, by the way, as this says, so we have a graph here, which is one of these graphs. Again, the x-axis is a Republican straight party vote by precinct. Again, the y-axis is calculating the Trump vote minus the Republican, right? So what do you see here? You see something quite profound. By the way, as Benny said, every blue dot is a precinct. So we probably have in Oakland County, Phil, do you know how many precincts? I don't want to count here, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to probably like 300, 400 precincts. I'm just guessing. But there's hundreds of precincts here, okay? So every blue dot is a precinct here. And what you're seeing is as you move from left to right, which means the left is low percentage of Republicans. So these communities over here on your left are low percentage of Republicans. And as you move to the right, higher percentage of Republicans demographically. Now, what's fascinating on this graph is common sense would dictate that as you moved across, you shouldn't see it go down. What this is saying is, for example, if you look down here on the bottom right here, this is a community that 80% of, or 75% of the people voted straight party Republican, which means 25% voted Democrat. But Trump is nearly 20% less than the mean here, or less than the Republican slate candidates, and so on. And more importantly, if you look at this data, it's not scattered. It's a beautiful line. Let's look at the closer at this. So if you just look at the left part of this, so I'm looking at less than 20%. So these are communities, precincts, where they're less than, you could argue, 20% demographically Republicans. And if you were to draw a line, an average, you see it's around 7%. So in this case, in those communities, even though they're not Republican, could be Black communities, minority communities, working class communities, Trump is more popular than other Republican candidates by about 7%. Okay, that's eyeballing that. So I hope that's clear. However, if you look in communities as Republicanism increases, Trump's votes go down. And they don't just go down in a random way. If you draw this beautiful center line, they go down in a very linear way. As more as precincts have more percentage of Republicans, Trump loses more percentage of votes in a linear fashion. Okay, which means in a way that graduates with the percentage of Republicans. Okay, so this is quite fascinating. In fact, it's highly unlikely. And so let's take an example. So we're going to take, again, we're looking at Oakland County. And by the way, these are early voting. Okay. And I'm going to take this data point right here. And if you look down, this data point's around 45%, which means 45% of the people in this precinct decided, of the people went straight party Republican vote, 45% voted Republican, which means 55% voted Biden. By the way, I'm taking a case here. So we want to be objective. This is a scientific engineering presentation. We don't want to choose Trump or Biden. Some of my Trump people say, hey, how come you don't want to show Trump got more votes? We don't want to do that. We don't want to bias the analysis here. But here's a vote where it's basically 45% of this precinct is Republican, deduced from the straight party voting, and the 55% is Democrat. Okay, so let's assume this is an example. We don't know the exact numbers, but Phil could probably look it up. But let's assume in that precinct there were 2,000 votes. Okay, 2,000 people actually came in and voted, to be specific. Okay, so 45% means 45% from where came from the Republican straight party voting. And if you look, because this number is minus 20 and the x-axis is plotting whatever Trump got minus a Republican, you can calculate Trump got 25%, right? 25% minus 45. So just to be clear, in that precinct, 45% of the people, of the people who did straight party voting, 45% were Republicans. So you could say 45% of that precinct is Republican. However, when you looked at in that precinct, what percentage voted for Trump? It was 25%, which means 20% less than what you would think, which means from the zero here. So if you just do the numbers, again, just to make this very tangible, if that precinct had 2,000 voters, and let's say 1,000 were straight party voters, so the Republican candidates would get 450 votes from the straight party voting, because 45%, and the Democrats, that obviously the difference of that, get 550 votes. Okay, so that's the straight party voters. Now, let's say the other 1,000 voted individual. They wanted to choose their own candidate. And we're assuming, or not we're assuming in this example, if you look at that curve, it's got to be 25%. So 250 voted for Trump and 750 voted for Biden. So in this case, what would AP News report or CNN or Fox? They would look at this data for that precinct. They'd say, okay, Trump got 700 votes total because 250 from individual candidates, 450 from the straight party voting. That's 700. And 700 out of 200 is 35%. Biden, however, got 550 votes from straight party voting Democrat, and he got 750 votes from Biden, from individual people voted. So that's 1,300. So he got 65%. And the news would report Trump lost to Biden by a margin of 30%. Okay. Now, each one of these precincts has been calculated. Okay. So now let me point you to this analysis. So now the concept of in the fact that 45% of people are Republican, Trump only got 25% votes is a little bit odd. So let's, for the sake of analysis, assume he also got 45%, the same number. That means a curve would go up to here, right? It'd be at the 0 point. And just to, again, make sure you're understanding the fundamentals. So let's say this point is 45% 0, which means that 45% votes from the Republican straight party voting, but Trump also got 45%. That's what you would assume if the Republican candidate is in alignment with the Republicans, okay? Now, if that precinct had also 2,000 voters, nothing has changed here. 450 for Republicans, candidates 550. But here, what you'll notice is Trump now picks up an additional 200 votes, right? Because he got now additional 20%, so he gets 450. Biden's at 550, okay? Changes a little bit the dynamics. This is very important to see this dynamics. And what you see, AP News, in this case, would report Trump got 45%, which is 900 votes out of the 2,000, and Biden got 1,100 votes, which is 55%. And the news would say, well, Trump didn't lose by that much. He didn't, in this case, lost by 30%. They say he lost by 10%, okay? However, when you really put this graph and this together, the net of it is what you find is this truth, which is an orange, that 10% of the Trump votes, if this was down here and it should have been up here, were given to Biden. And 200 votes were taken from Trump, and 200 votes were given to Biden. So total of, so this would mean 10% of Trump votes were given to Biden. All right. So what Phil did, Phil Evans, he did this for every precinct. And he found out when you really bring Trump's votes, what we think the pattern should be around the straight party vote line, you find out about 20,000 votes were taken from Trump, and 20,000 votes were given to Biden for a 40,000 Biden lead in the Oakland early voting, okay? Just one county. So that's what you see here. Now, more importantly, if you notice, I've drawn these orange lines. So what you notice is this phenomenon, if you actually look below 20%, Trump was actually getting more votes than Republican candidates, right? All the way up to 20%, you see he was getting close to 7% more votes than his other Republican counterparts. But for some reason, which we'll talk about, right at 20%, it looks like his vote counts start getting linearly reduced. And if you look at this curve, and I've looked at lots of curves, Benny, you've seen a lot of these curves, Phil, right? Any one of us who's in the pattern analysis business, when you see this, it's immediately, if you look at these, you say something's up, okay? This is too structured, right? Too perfect.
Yeah.
What is that, Benny?
Too perfect.
Too perfect, okay? You don't, we in data analysis, pattern analysis, if you're in AI, you look for features like these because it lets you build an algorithm, right? This is easy. So this beautiful curve hits flat and boom, it drops in a nice linear fashion. As though an algorithm was there as you went across, votes were getting cut by Trump. And that's what we see here. And remember, we've talked about it, the election systems going back to Diebold, right, Benny? They have the feature of being able to manipulate vote counts from one person to another. It's called a weighted race feature. So you see it here. Now, is it only in Oakland County in early voting? Well, let's look here. Here's election day voting. Right, Phil? This is election day we're looking at. And you see the same thing. Election day, there's around 20,000 votes. 10,000, Trump's votes are reduced by 10,000, and Biden's votes were increased by 10,000 here. But look at this pattern. Same thing. It's around 7%, and boom. Okay? Slope looks Pretty damn close, doesn't it, Phil, Benny?
Yep.
Looks very, very close. Okay. On a different time. The reason this is important is this is in one time period. So temporally, we're going to look at temporal, which means by time, and spatially. So temporally, we're looking at one event before election day, early voting, and this is after early voting. You see the same feature. All right. Now, let's go into a different county. Is this only in Oakland? By the way, Oakland is one of the biggest counties. And by the way, I want to put both of them together. You see that in this, when you add it all up, 60,000 votes increased Biden's lead, right? So a total of 30,000 votes were reduced for Trump and 30,000 votes were increased for Biden. So Biden's margin increased by 60,000 votes. All right, so that's Oakland County. Now let's look at a different county. Again, spatially, we're going to a different place and a different time, early voting, Macomb County. Here there were 28,000 votes. 14,000 were taken from Trump, 14,000 were given to Biden. And what do you see here? Well, in this case, Trump actually does even better. He's almost at, what does that look like? About 12%, Benny? 12%? 12%. And then here, this kicks in around at 25%. Okay, but same sort of slope. Okay, so they start eating Trump's votes at this point, but he's doing better in these counties by 12% more than the Republican Party candidates. Okay, he's doing better. Now let's go over here to Macomb County on election day. Okay, same feature you see. In fact, he's doing really good here, up to 22%. Right, Phil? That's what that looks like.
22.
Right in the election day voting. All right. Yeah, it looks like 22% on election day. In the non, more democratic.
Phil is telling us. I think he's looking at the graph. What'd you say, Phil?
Well, I was looking at the export. Yeah, you're right.
Yep. Yeah. And then again, it drops precipitously when right around here. Okay, but same feature, same algorithm is in place. By the way, when we say same algorithm, it can be weighted for populations, et cetera. Now we look at, again, the same thing here. So total, when you look at Macomb County, a total of 16,500 votes were taken away from Trump. By the way, these are minimum. And 16,500 votes were given to Biden. So a total of 33,000 lead. So if you take 33 plus 60, we're up to 93,000 votes between Macomb and Oakland County. Now we want to look at Kent County. And Phil, when you generated this data, I believe you combined both early and election day. So we have all of it together. And here you see nearly 45,000 vote margin for Biden, which means around 22,500 votes were taken from Trump. 22,500 votes were given to Biden. And what you see here is a 45,000 margin. And again, in these communities, which are more Democrat communities, Trump's doing well. And then again, the algorithm kicks in and Trump's votes start getting eaten. And what's fascinating about this is here's a community which is nearly, if you look at this precinct right here, that's 85% people who came in, voted Republican, and Trump's down by 25%. Just think about that. So that means Trump actually got 60% here votes, or if that's 85, you got 60% here, less. I'm sorry, it was 60%. There's a 25% difference. Okay,
you could even make the argument that even if you want to believe that Republicans hated Trump so much, the larger that the population size were, they still wouldn't be able to hate him in such a perfect line.
Exactly. This is the important point. So we'll come to this in our conclusion. But people like Mitt Romney have said, well, generally Republicans are still Republicans, but they got tired of Trump, right? But you wouldn't see it in this beautiful linear straight line. It would be like a cluster, and we'll talk about that. Very good point, Benny. So that's the data. Now, before we go, we do have a fourth county, which is Wayne County, predominantly Democrat. Okay. And what you're going to see here is something quite alarming, but also spectacular, is this graph. What do you see here? Isn't this fascinating? Wayne County, in fact, it looks like at least this algorithm was not applied. Maybe they did other stuff, and we're not going to even speculate. We want to take a scientific approach here. But what you see here is, look at this. When you put the Trump line, it looked like Trump was doing 10% better. Now, these are predominantly Detroit. I would say, Benny, would you say predominantly black communities? His
that's
minority, but so Trump is actually doing better. He was actually doing better, and there was some evidence that a lot of the people in the black community were moving away to Trump. Maybe not to Republican voters, but to Trump. And you see that phenomenon here. So our view is, that this algorithm, what we're talking about here, this algorithm was not applied here. Maybe something else was. We haven't detected it, but it's clear that Trump was doing better among Democrat precincts.
The other point, Shiva, is you could see that you could establish some real upper and lower control limits here,
Yep.
because there is the presence of a line, but with the other ones, it's going straight down. There's no such thing as an upper and lower control limit.
Right. So I mean, it's almost like we call it a transistor function, right? At a certain point, you cut off. And transistors go straight down, but this kind of, from an engineering standpoint, it's a ramp function. But anyway, not to get too technical, but this algorithm in place. So we say, quote unquote, no cheating, no algorithm applied. So that's the data. So what do the results show? Let's conclude on the results. Well, the algorithm that's there moves Trump votes to Biden. That's what it's doing. And I don't think anyone will argue with it, because we've seen Trump votes moving to Biden. The second thing is that as precincts increase with a higher percentage of Republicans, greater percentage of Trump votes are transferred to Biden. So you would think, wow, more people are Republicans in this precinct. You would think Trump would do better. In fact, it seems like going to Republican precincts was his worst nightmare. You lose more. He lost higher percentage of votes, the more Republican precincts they were. Another way to think about this is the more the precinct was Republican, the more percent of Trump votes are transferred to Biden in that precinct. I'll repeat that. The more the precinct was Republican, the more the percent of Trump votes are transferred to Biden. And by case in point, let's just go look back here at Kent County. This very dramatic graph here. So very Republican. This is almost like 90% Republican. Trump got nearly 25% votes lost there, e.g. transferred to Biden. Okay? That's what we're looking at here. So this is just looking at the data. So the slope of the discount to Trump's votes is the same for each county. That's what's more interesting. What do I mean by that? What is the slope? Again, people, if you have forgotten algebra, right? Y equals mx. This slope, this line, this is a little bit steeper, but by and large, the slope is pretty much the same. Okay? So the slope of that line looks very similar. And that's what we wanted to make here. The slope of the discount to Trump's votes is reasonably, quote unquote, I should put the same for each county. Now, Wayne County, other result, had no algorithm we detected, right? That was just flat. And that was very much like the work that Phil did here in Massachusetts, where we looked at Franklin County. It was all hand counted. Remember that, Phil? It was all flat. We didn't see any changes. Okay. So what's the discussion? So those are the results. Let's have a discussion here. So the algorithm, we believe, is a weighted race allocation method. It's a transfer of a percent of votes from one candidate to another. As we've discussed, the percent is a weighted decimal value, and we can calculate it as we get more data. But clearly, the weighted race method, and one of the things is the weighted race, as we mentioned at the outset, is a documented feature in election systems as early as 2001. And all major vendors, we had a discussion about that, right? It's not just Dominion, it's all of them are believed to have this feature. Diebold, as we showed in 2001, had, maybe it was earlier, but Bev Harris's work uncovered it was originally in the Diebold systems. Am I missing anything there, Benny?
No, that the breakup of the election industry started with Diebold. So all of the software that the other vendors probably would have used, the source code would have originated from the Diebold.
Right. Yeah, right. So there we go. So let's go back. So what we see here, so that's a discussion. The other piece of this discussion, why are more percent of Trump votes? So we want to ask some questions. In science, in engineering, we have to actually solve a problem. So you have to get down to the heart of the real problem, right? We're not politicians here. Phil is an engineer. I'm an engineer. Benny's an engineer. We all program software. We can't BS our way out of talking our way out of stuff. Our software doesn't work. Something's wrong. So we always have to ask some profound questions to find the heart of the issue. So one question is, why are more percent of Trump votes transferred to Biden in precincts that have more Republicans? It's an interesting question. Second question is this, are both Republicans and Democrats involved in supporting this algorithm? Interesting question, because you have Republican precincts and in Democrat precincts, the algorithm is not on. So what's going on? Are both parties involved? So, and the other question we probably need to ask, and again, this is more research, are both parties aware of such features in these voting systems? We're hearing now news, there's lawsuits against Dominion, right? That's happening, others, but are both parties aware of these features? Another question is it possible that this pattern is normal and explains a normal voting pattern? What do we mean by this pattern? We're talking about that line going, just to be clear, we're talking about that line going across and then coming down at a certain point, that pattern, line going across and coming down. So is it possible that's just normal? Well, that just happens. This is not no algorithm, you guys are trying to say, but is it possible that's normal? And we had a big discussion among our team on this because we really wanted to, again, provide everyone, because we think this is a very important issue for the entire country, for that matter, those people who have suffrage now in the world and we're relying on these technology systems. Maybe is this just normal? Well, and in fact, for example, Mitt Romney would say, and he has said this, the pattern makes sense. He would say, look, since Republicans stayed Republican, but no longer like Trump, this could be true, right? This could be true. However, if that's the case of what Mitt Romney says, look, Republicans broadly are still Republicans, but there's a percentage of them, across the board who just don't like Trump, right? They just don't like him. Trump lost votes, and that's just the way it is, okay? Well, if that were true, what would you see? You would see this.
Right.
You would see all these precincts deviating from the norm, at some distribution like this, all right? But that's not what we see, right? But that's not what we see. What we see is a predictable line, a decline of dislike for Trump with increasing percentage of Republican precincts. We actually see this. We don't see this. If Mitt Romney was right, you would see this. Or if any rational person would write, oh yeah, Trump just pissed off a lot of Republicans everywhere. Well, across all precincts, you'd see this everywhere. But what we see is this. In fact, we see a beautiful line, which you could go back to your Algebra 1 class and write an equation for, y equals mx plus b, and I could draw that line. I could calculate it precisely. So precisely, I could put it into a computer program. That's how precisely I could do this. And I'm sure we could do this in any function, probably in 5-10 minutes. We haven't gotten there yet. Any software engineer listening can do this. So just to be clear, Mitt, if you're listening, if what you were saying, Mitt, that would sure be like this, but the reality is like this. And I think Mitt would probably find this a little more, I would be illuminated if he could answer this in some normal means. So given that this predictable linear decline of dislike increases, it makes no sense, right? This makes no sense unless a computer algorithm was in place to lower Trump's votes as a function of percentage of Republicans in a precinct. In this case, linearly, okay? That curve, boom, it goes down beautifully linear. So let me just bring that back to everyone, and I'll ask Phil and Benny if you want to add, and we still have some other stuff to finish, but what we're saying is that beautiful point where it's nice and flat, Trump's actually doing well in non-Republican precincts, and then it's like a switch gets turned on and it goes down linearly. Our position is that could only be done by a computer algorithm in such a precise way over so many precincts, okay? It's not like, because over so many precincts, you'd see some random fluctuations. You don't. You see a nice little line going there. Phil and Benny, do you want to add anything to that discussion point?
Phil's the man.
Phil?
You said it pretty well. The main thing is, Benny, I greatly respect the work you've done. And is there any doubt in your mind, what percentage chance is it that what we're seeing is not a computer algorithm?
Let me just ask that for everyone's audience, because Phil's on phone here, because he's got, what Phil asked Benny is, what is the chance that that pattern, let me go back here, the pattern that we're talking about is not a computer algorithm? That was a question Phil asked you, Benny.
Yeah, I rarely would say 0%, so I maybe say 1%. If you get in trouble if you don't leave a little room for error. It's just not something you would see. Again, the engineering is reversing the organization of the precincts. And as they grow in size, at some point you're supposed to strike an average. So that means if we got to precincts, if they were continuing to increase and we had 100% turnout, then that number would just grow further in the size, and that line and that slope would continue to go down. And that is literally the presence of something that is not, it's barely germane to something that's natural. It's something that's artificial.
Right. So that's the bottom line here. So the bottom line is this is the probability of this from any mathematical description, you would call it, I'm just going forward again, is unlikely. Now, so the future research questions we have as scientists and researchers is, hey, are both parties, Democrats and Republicans, aware of this algorithmic process? Another question, is a coup underway? You know, and who would be behind such a coup? Democrats, Republicans, or both? Or you could argue, did Biden win legitimately? That's
By
all
how much?
possibility. What's up?
Did he have a landslide and we just don't know it?
Yeah, did he have such a massive landslide that
because we analyzed one county based on someone saying that they saw some switches and it being confirmed that votes did switch. We've analyzed this in this mechanism for 4 or 5 years. I've done it with Phil for at least 2 or 3. So we already knew how to go and look, but you know, it was kind of a gift that somebody acknowledged that it was there.
Yeah. So, but again, we're being open. Our goal is to just ask these important questions. Again, the questions in the future, are both parties and Democrats aware of the algorithmic process? Is there a coup underway? Who is behind such a coup? Democrats, Republicans, or both? Or did Biden